The realm of media is like a vast abyss. That's the description I came up with 3 years ago. I sought to look at a complicated thing and simplify it, make it approachable. So I put together a video about the golden age of DC Comics and called it a day. I made a couple mistakes, plus, people change and so do opinions. So I went back, dug deeper, and started trying to uncover everything about DC Comics that I could. I mean, who would I be if I wasn't thorough? I put together some videos, I still made a couple mistakes, but fewer, and it was much more in depth. Now at this point, I've stepped into the golden age of the comics proper, so this is a video about what came before that. It's a cumulative video, stuff I worked on years ago, so it has a few problems, mic quality and changes to the format being the biggest, but if you want to know everything there is to know about DC Comics before Superman came into the picture, this is the only stop you'll have to make. But one quick referendum before we get into the main course. In my attempt to simplify everything, I oversimplified the eras of comics. I broke it down into just the golden, silver, bronze, and modern ages. In reality, there are about 7 ages, at least according to the League of Comic Geeks, which I'll mostly be adhering to from now on. I'm gonna put that distinction up on screen now. So, if I say a particular era in these videos, I'll be throwing up a little clarifying note, along with anything else that's less accurate than I would have liked. All set? Alright, let's take it from the top. I feel like, for the longest time, many of the biggest properties have been practically impenetrable. 100 years ago, the worst thing you'd have to worry about with something like this would be keeping your Sherlock Holmes novels in the right order, or maybe more taxingly, something like Conan the Barbarian. The thing is, though, in the past century, media has expanded, and even if you keep on top of things like all the films and shows connected to a franchise, there's still bundles of things you're missing anyways. One of the most difficult mediums to get into these days for many reasons is comics. You can say you're a fan of Batman, for example, but still there's always this looming fact that there's thousands upon thousands of stories featuring him that you haven't gotten around to yet. So starting here, we're going to take a look at one of the 2 big comic book publishers and talk about them from their foundation up to the modern age. Think of it like a guidebook to DC Comics. We'll be talking about characters, stories, movies, everything that's worth discussing. We're going to take it simply, so by the end of it, whenever that winds up being, you can say you're a true blue expert on all things DC. My ultimate goal is to provide a breakdown and guide to the DC universe in order of creation, so it isn't quite as overwhelming. If you have a favorite character or story and it isn't in a video, it's likely to be found in a video coming later down the line, since we're doing everything step by step. So, to the newbies, welcome, and to the oldies, welcome back. Let's talk about DC Comics. So, it seems appropriate to start our journey through the annals of DC's history with its founder, Major Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson. The Major, as most people refer to him as, was born in Tennessee in 1890. After his father abandoned the family and Malcolm's sister passed away quickly thereafter, he and his mother had to move to a relative's house in New York City when he was 4. His mother, Antoinette Wheeler, sometime shortly after that point, joined a women's magazine company and made another move, this time to Portland. After that move, Antoinette remarried to a fellow named T.J.B. Nicholson and hyphenated her name. Malcolm, a big fan of his new stepdad, followed suit. Into his adulthood, Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson joined the U.S. Cavalry, and went to a staggering number of places during his time with them, interestingly including a secret mission to the Mongolian border. During his service, he found love while stationed in Paris, meeting the aristocratic Elsa Björkborn and honeymooning in Scotland. The thing is, though, the Major was a man ahead of his time when it came to social issues, and this came to a head while serving in the military. As a U.S. Major, Wheeler-Nicholson oversaw a squadron of African-American Buffalo soldiers, who he viewed as both capable and of equal standing to the other members of the military. Being the 1920s, this rubbed his superior officers the wrong way. He was constantly mistreated for his views on equal rights, and in turn tried his best to fight back against this. He inevitably sent a letter to President Harding arguing about the situation, which probably only made things worse. Then he was taken to court by his superintendent for insubordinate behavior, and then things violently reached a head when he was shot by a fellow officer, although the exact details of that incident are a little fuzzy. After all of this, the Major was discharged and wound up living a civilian life once again. In 1924, responding to a new calling, he found himself writing for pulp magazines, and a year later opened a publishing house called Wheeler-Nicholson Inc. About 9 years later is when DC Comics itself finally begins. The business was originally named National Allied Publications, the more recognizable title coming later on. The Major had always found it curious that comics up to that point were collections of things like pulp stories and newspaper strips, and never wholly original creations. He saw this as an untapped market, and set to work on a plus-sized comic magazine called New Fun. It was later published in February of 1935. That doesn't mean it was a cut-and-dry process, though. Heck, it wasn't even that big of a success. One of the first problems foreseen by the Major was to do with recognizable characters. As is the same nowadays, most people are far more willing to risk their money on characters they already recognize over an unknown entity. He wanted to use someone from fiction that people would be interested in, but just honestly couldn't find any that weren't already licensed elsewhere, so he made do with new protagonists. Many of the stories that Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson had a direct hand in drew inspiration from his own lived experience, most especially from his time in service. So National Allied began, and immediately began to struggle fiscally. The Major knew this was likely too, and intended to expand fast in order to have their name in the market more prolifically. But coupled with their finance issues and inconsistent publication cycles, they didn't get very far very quickly. In fact, Malcolm became infamous for his inability to pay his employees on time. There's even a record of employees overhearing a conversation he had on the phone with his wife after they couldn't afford to pay the milkman. Needless to say, things were tough. Making his biggest play to finally start making money instead of losing it, Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson hired Harry Donenfeld to help back his third magazine, Detective Comics. But Donenfeld seemingly had some plans of his own in mind. After a time working together and knowing where Malcolm was financially, Donenfeld gave him some money to pay for the Major and his family to take a trip to Cuba, a seemingly unexpected act of kindness. But when Malcolm returned from the trip, he found the business's locks had been changed, and old Harry had done enough legal mumbo-jumbo during his absence to become the company's new owner alongside his longtime business partner, Jack Liebowitz. So, that's it then. Wheeler-Nicholson started the company, and only 3 years later found himself locked outside of it. Without much to do about the situation, as unfortunate as it was, Malcolm returned to writing articles and living a private life away from the comic book industry. Now I think it's time to switch to the other side of the story, as upsetting as it may be. So, Harry Donenfeld, someone I'd describe as a real mixed bag. Donenfeld was born into a Jewish family in Romania, immigrating to New York's Lower East Side around the age of 6. From there, his father passed away when he was 15, being left as the sole financial provider to his mother and 3 brothers. Because of the necessity of his situation, Harry dropped out of school and became an energetic clothing salesman, gifted with silver-tongued speech and the social skills of a swindler. Once the First World War was underway, Donenfeld was drafted and succinctly reported the difficult situation that would put his family into, leading him to avoid joining the military. At one point or another, his brothers opened a printing company, and Harry hopped on board. But this proved to be the start of his worst recurring business model. You see, Harry had this habit of becoming a part of a business during a time of struggle, then becoming the owner when things reached a breaking point. After this first time with his brother's printing company, most future instances were due to those companies incurring large debts to his printing company. But under the company, he made some smart and sometimes even well-intentioned choices, including distribution of women's liberation leaflets, and separately, under the table, producing his own erotic pulp magazines like Spicy Mystery and Spicy Western, which were distributed alongside bootlegged whiskey. I mean, it isn't that hard of a step to take, I suppose. By that time, he'd already made friends with known gangsters like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky. But time marches on. Donenfeld made legitimate business partners with Jack Liebowitz, and the two shift gears after the Prohibition wraps, setting their eyes on National Allied publications. Now, to be fair, it's unclear if Donenfeld and Liebowitz in any way manipulated Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson into going further into debt, or if they simply took advantage of an already bad situation, but in either case, they don't really come out looking like the good guys in this story. But, as mentioned in the previous profile, Donenfeld pulled some trickery. While Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson was on his trip to Cuba, Harry submitted the company for bankruptcy, and then bought it up in the auction with Jack and became the new duo in charge of the operation. And that's essentially the story of DC's inception. But Harry's story also has a sad epilogue. Decades later, in 1962, Harry Donenfeld was set to marry his second wife, but a week before the ceremony, suffered a traumatic brain injury, irreparably impacting his memory and speech functions. Sent to a care home to live out the rest of his days in this dramatically impaired state, Donenfeld passed away 3 years later due to further complications relating to his brain injury. It's odd, isn't it, that these two vastly different people would be the starting point for such a wide and expansive narrative universe. That Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, all of it, started with a major and a mobster. Born as a part of a Russian Jewish family in 1900, Yakov Liebowitz and his family relocated when he was 10 years old to the Lower East Side of New York City, fairly close to Donenfeld, though the two were yet to cross paths. Yakov never knew anything about his biological father, but for all intents and purposes, his stepfather, Julius, was his dad. Once they landed in the United States, the family had their names changed to fit in better. Thus, Julius became Julius, and young Yakov Liebowitz became Jacob Liebowitz, usually going by Jack. Jack's early life wasn't particularly out of the ordinary for a young immigrant. His first job was as a newsboy, and in high school he realized he had a particular gift for accounting. Fast forward to age 24, and he has an accounting degree under one arm, and at age 27 had a wife under the other. Finding work as an accountant wasn't particularly hard for young Liebowitz either. His father, for some time, had been a steward for the Ladies' Garment Workers Union, and they were in need of an accountant. Now, I don't want to understate that he was genuinely gifted when it came to the financial realm. Described as cold, ruthless, and innately effective, Jack became both widely known and greatly respected in union circles. While he was with the LGWU, a printing company was selected to help distribute their leaflets, the same one that belonged to Harry Donenfeld. Finally, the two had met. Now, Donenfeld was always happy to be doing business, and doing it successfully was even better. So at some point, Julius, Jack's father, asked Donenfeld if he'd be willing to hire his son as his personal business manager. Donenfeld, taking pride in providing work to his fellow American immigrants, brought Liebowitz aboard, and the two got to work. They worked well together, too. Donenfeld was always known for being energetic and overexcited, whereas Liebowitz was the polar opposite. This balanced the two, and they came out stronger for it. Liebowitz would often direct his partner to the most ideal pathways. So when the prohibition ended and the police began to crack down on Harry's erotic magazine publications, Jack convinced him to look at stronger business ventures, since their two largest sources of income had been simultaneously curtailed. They popped into National Allied Publications, and 3 years later, Jack became the sole owner after purchasing it at an auction, accompanied, as always, by Harry. Once he was the man in the chair and Donenfeld was the man in the shorter chair, Leibowitz's next addition to DC's canon would pave the way for something greater than any one publishing company could have anticipated. His desired project was another anthology comic magazine with more fantastical elements. Its name would be Action Comics, the soon-to-be stomping grounds of the Man of Tomorrow. Because of Superman's raging success, Jack's favorite activity quickly became overseeing his inclusion in other media. Radio plays, television, newspaper strips, the whole gamut. Even later down the line, Liebowitz, through some smart business moves, also became a partner with National Allied Publications' sister company, All American Publications. Sprinkle in Harry's habit for business takeovers, and within a year, All American has become another part of the company. Jack stayed as president of the company up until 1967, when they got sold off to Warner Brothers. Given the timeline, personally, I have to wonder if the decision may have been influenced by the passing of Donenfeld 2 years earlier. But following the sale, Liebowitz switched gears, becoming a member of the board and continued to oversee things from the boardroom until 1991, when he finally retired at age 91. I have to wonder if he even bothered to give himself a retirement package. Sheldon Mayer is someone whose creations often resonate with me, and probably plenty of others, since he kept the idea train rolling for close to 6 decades. Mayer was born in Harlem, the latest addition to a growing Jewish family. I might describe him as a workaholic, since he'd found his way to working at Fleischer Animations when he was just 17. Scoot the timeline forward a bit, and he was also one of the first half-dozen employees at National Allied Publications, crafting countless characters, like the semi-autobiographical Scribbly Gibbet and the endlessly endearing Sugar and Spike, even well before Siegel and Shuster introduced Superman to the comic page. In fact, on that note, it's also long been rumored that he may have had a hand in the Blue Boy Scouts' launch into print. The rumor goes that Liebowitz, planning on starting up Action Comics, was adamant about getting as many ideas pitched as possible, so he could whittle things down to what he saw as the cream of the crop. Mayer, after submitting his own fair share, started poking around the office and found Superman in Siegel and Shuster's slush pile, a sort of pile of rejected ideas that maybe they'd either scrap or circle around to at a later date. Now, it's worth noting that Siegel and Shuster always believed that their superhero idea had merit, so it probably would have never gone far enough to actually be disposed of, but Mayer himself insists that he did certainly play a part that led to us getting Superman at the time we did. Anyways, always working, Sheldon spread himself out to a bundle of different publishers, until 1939, when he entered into a signed partnership with All American Publications, which was National Allied's sister company. The two businesses were also always very open to collaboration, so there was still a pretty frequent crossover of works. But having done so much, and having made, as I mentioned, countless characters, Sheldon Mayer actually retired in 1948, though I don't know if I would describe it as a retirement, since his output was still quite frequent, even if you were to argue it was on a more casual basis by his standards. I mean, the man was still making comics in the 1970s, despite his failing eyesight. He even got cataract surgery and just kept on trucking well until he passed away in the early 90s. You've got to admire the work ethic. Clearly, Sheldon Mayer was a man who loved what he did for a living and kept at it as long as he was living. Barry O'Neill is often attributed as DC's first action hero, and as would quickly become common practice in the early days of comics, was more so a vehicle to tell these adventure stories than actually being a dynamic piece of the narrative. O'Neill was created by Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson, and was used in a bundle of differing pulps and comics over the years, sometimes as simple literature and sometimes even with other comic publishers. It seems like Malcolm was just never satisfied with how he wrote about Barry O'Neill, and often found himself back at the drawing board, starting over their story from scratch. If you've noticed some of my older videos, you know I can relate. Not much is known about our intrepid adventurer, in all honesty. His family life, background, heck, even his shoe size is left undetermined. But that being said, Barry was still front and center to plenty of Golden Age stories, usually traveling around the world and fighting injustice in plenty of different forms. Spies, competing thieves, foreign invaders, all the classic kinds of enemies you'd expect to find in a comic book from the 1930s. I mean, on the note of Barry's characterization, I think Wheeler-Nicholson probably took inspiration from Sherlock Holmes, if I can hypothesize a little here. Barry O'Neill was an intelligent and capable man paired with Inspector LeGrand, who was essentially a hybrid of Watson and Inspector Lestrade, and often fought against his mentally equal competitor, an arguable stand-in for Moriarty named Fang Gao, who I will not be sharing pictures of because, well, comic books for a really long time were often less than kind to anyone who wasn't an ultra-white American citizen, Fang Gao included. But in any case, Barry O'Neill set the starting mark for DC characters, and while pretty simply surpassed, definitely deserves some attention as we take our tour through their history. He was one of the first figures of focus, and has been here since the beginning in New Fun number 1. While Inspector LeGrand is someone I mentioned briefly while talking about Barry O'Neill, he also played a pretty hefty role in their stories, and I figured should get a little play as well. Barry was a pretty simplistic figure, as I said before, but LeGrand was practically a single run-on sentence character description with zero flesh beyond the handful of phrases attributed to him at the initial stages of creation. Inspector LeGrand was the assistant to Barry O'Neill. He was a smart man, but benefited regularly from the higher intellect of O'Neill. He was, in spirit, a prototype of the sidekick archetype. He had little agency and was in essence just a walking information hub for whatever nefarious activity needed Barry's attention next. See, Inspector LeGrand was a French police officer who was often privy to matters of international concern, and would basically get in touch with O'Neill and point him at whoever the bad guys were that month. I think it's worth mentioning, though not as significantly offensive as Fang Gao, LeGrand was also played up as a stereotypical Frenchman, oftentimes speaking with a strong accent written phonetically to emphasize his Frenchness, I guess. Oh boy, these were rough days. Sometimes characters are attached at the hip, just like these two kids, Binks and Bobby. So why not cover them both at once? Again, the very early days of DC Comics didn't have particularly three-dimensional characters, so bear with me while we cover what we can. It's never explained if Binks and Bobby are friends or family. Personally, I think both, but in either case, whether family or not, they spend every moment together, best of friends. During a rainstorm, lost and turned around, the two decide it's become necessary to seek out shelter and wait for the storm to pass. They discover an old building, abandoned, dusty, grimy, and on a table, faintly glowing, is a crystal ball. But this thing isn't just a tool for fortune telling. No, what they've found is the esoteric item known only as the magic crystal of history. In their first encounter with the crystal, Binks and Bobby are drawn to the light emanating from the orb, and are drawn further into it. Literally into it. Within the blink of an eye, they find themselves in ancient Egypt. Now, as a storytelling device, the crystal worked pretty well, and served as a way to share segments of history in a way that I think was pretty clearly meant to be some kind of edutainment. Each time we visited the kids, it was a new adventure with a different historical figure. After the first trip, the crystal only gave Binks and Bobby a view at history, and never brought them to the time period directly like it did the first time. I mean, to be fair, time travel wasn't as frequently explored in stories as it is now, and probably would have distracted from the actual point of the stories if the readers became too focused on the specific mechanics of tampering with major historical events. But in any case, Binks and Bobby got plenty of use out of that magic crystal. Showing up about 50 times, they explored plenty of moments in history, including the stories of Queen Anne, Oliver Cromwell, and eventually calling it quits after peeping on the history of Peter the Great. Okay, so we've got a weird entry for you all. Dinosaurs. One of the things I wanted to draw some focus to was special races that exist in the DC universe, and it just so happens that the first to really crop up are dinosaurs. That being said, I'd also like to note that I am far from any kind of reliable knowledge on real-world dinosaurs. I mean, I talk about comics, like, come on. But still, there's some unique stuff to DC when it comes to the Thunder Lizards that I'd like to touch on. So, spoiler alert, but the dinosaurs get wiped out by a meteor. But in Earth 2, a few manage to hang around. They'd pop in here and there and provide a recognizable but interesting monster, usually as a threat to whoever's the star of that story. Aside from that, there's actually a decent number of the aquatic dinosaurs kicking around in the deeper depths of the ocean, most specifically near the ancient underwater city of Atlantis. This usually holds true for other iterations of the underwater nation as well. In Earth 1, there's a couple other spots to regularly find these elephantastic geckos, though the specifics of how the place functions are super pseudoscientific. They can be found in Scartaris, which is a bubble-shaped ecosystem deep near the core of the Earth. It was initially founded by the Atlanteans, but most of them eventually dipped out after someone mentioned the whole thing about Atlantis sinking. The other big spot is the cleverly named Dinosaur Island. It's figured that it may be connected to Scartaris, so there may actually be some crossover of animal life there, though that's never really been set in stone. Dinosaur Island lies somewhere in the South Pacific, and it's not exactly an ideal vacation venue. Hop into New Earth, and we've got one more focal point for these Triassic terrors, and that's in the plateau of Maple White Land in the country of Ryogwe, one of DC's many fictionalized countries with a name super close to the real one it's mimicking, like Bialia and Karak. This one's a little more interesting, at least, since Maple White Land holds extinct species from every era on Earth, meaning you could have some weird habitational combos, like maybe dodos and velociraptors are besties in that place. Who knows? Wayne Brady is an American television personality, comedian. Wait a minute. Wing Brady. Wing Brady was another character to join the comic world through New Fun #1 and just like the protagonists from the other stories in the same book, he was ultimately pretty flat and worked best as a way to just tell some adventure stories. Brady was a pilot who volunteered his skills to the French Foreign Legion, though he had plenty of stories where he was on foot too. Most of the time he was plunked down in North Africa, going on pulp-grade endeavors that had him knocking out bandits, smugglers, and corrupted power figures, eventually zeroing in on that last one the most as he became a spy later in his career. I'll be frank here, I want to give a comprehensive history of DC, so I felt like I had to talk about Wing Brady, but that's pretty much all there is to him. So let's put a nice little bow on it and move on to our next entry. In 1908, eventual executive editor Whitney Ellsworth was born in Brooklyn, a man who would become a driving force behind a whole truckload of the company's creative decisions. We don't know much about his private life, but at age 19, having at some point gathered a personal interest in becoming a creative artist, Whit took a course at the YMCA and then took the leap into newspaper strips. Eventually, Whitney came into contact with Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson, who invited him onto National Allied Publications as an assistant editor, with the chance for upward mobility. As we know, Malcolm wasn't around for very long, and Whitney actually left the company around the same time that the locks were changed, choosing to pack up his things and travel to California. But having relocated, Ellsworth had the time to ponder what he wanted to do, and just over a year later, came back to the company, full of ideas and renewed vigor. He became a major creative guide for National Allied Publications as a whole, giving a yay or nay for countless comic ideas. His most notable decision, out of all of them, came with Batman #1. You see, it was pretty bog standard for the heroes to win the day, and that was usually predicated on the death of the story's villain. So most of the time, if not nearly every time, villains would appear a total of one time, and then have a nice grave dug for them after the last panel of the same issue. This model held true even during the writing phase of Batman's first standalone comic. They introduced the Joker. You might have heard of him, and we'll talk about him relatively soon, but after giving the Dark Knight a run for his bottomless money, he was killed off at the climax of the comic. Whitney Ellsworth took a look through the story, as he did with countless others before, and felt like the Joker had a much greater potential than could be used up in one paperback. So the choice was made on his instruction. The Joker lived. Ellsworth continued his work with DC for a long while, also getting the opportunity to operate as their movie studio contact, becoming a producer for Superman serials, and later The Adventures of Superman in the 1950s. He kept up the good work until the early 1970s, eventually retiring. Also, quick side note, I admittedly haven't watched Deadwood. It's on my list, but apparently there's a character named Whitney Ellsworth, and he's actually named after our Whitney, which I think is pretty neat. So, Vincent Sullivan was born in 1911, and we know pretty much next to nothing about the guy himself. He was a cartoonist for the Brooklyn Eagle before signing on as an artist at National Allied Publications. After Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson was kicked out the front door, Vincent managed to convince Donenfeld and Liebowitz to make him their new editor-in-chief. In that role, he made two notable choices amongst others. First, he secured the rights to Superman from Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, a decision that ultimately ruined the duo financially, and he was also the one to contact Bob Kane initially about building a new superhero, which ultimately led to Batman. Then, in April of 1939, a special comic was published by the company to coincide with the New York's World Fair. It was titled, pretty unoriginally, New York's World Fair Comics #1. The reason I bring this up? Well, Vincent Sullivan was executive editor for this particular paperback, but barely saw a cent from it. Eventually, things escalated to a dispute over royalties, and by the following year, he stormed out of the office, never to work for National Allied again. Wait a second, I thought Green Arrow came after Superman. Oh. Born Robert Fizztooth in the latter half of the 12th century, Robin Hood's story begins with his return from the Crusades. He finds his family castle in ruins, and even later finds that royal dillweed Prince John has usurped his elder brother, King Richard the Lionheart. Most people know the rest. Sherwood Forest, steal from the rich, give to the poor, yada yada. But we're covering the DC side of things here, so what's different from the usual stuff printed in the 1,000,001 retellings we've seen in the past 600 plus years? Well, mostly it has to do with encounters with time-traveling superheroes, usually Green Arrow, funnily enough. The first time kind of goes as follows. There's this guy, named Guy, of Gisborne, and he's a rival to Robin Hood, usually competing with him for the affection of Maid Marian. Well, somebody offed him, and everybody's pointing fingers at our Lincoln Green lad. Then, here's Green Arrow and Speedy, time travelers from the far-off year of 1942, here to clear his name. They shake hands and call it a day. Then he meets a handsome fellow named Batman and his young ward Robin, from the even further off year of 1946. They participate in an archery tournament, shake hands, and, again, call it a day. He gets a neat half-dozen more visits from future farers, and literally does nothing about the constant stream of people lining up to stare at him in mild awe. That isn't to say that he didn't have any adventures in line with his classic style. In fact, he got plenty of them, but most were pretty standard fare, so I figured they don't need to be discussed in much detail. In any case, Robin Hood's life, aside from a handful of weird encounters, was pretty much identical to how it was in the legends. Personally, I still think the best version is the one from Men in Tights, but that's just me. Mikhail Segelovic arrived at the docks of New York in 1900, accompanied by his wife, Sora Keichels. The two had finally immigrated to America, having fled their motherland of Lithuania following concerns about the nation's ever-rising anti-Semitism. Once there, as was common practice, the two adopted Americanized names to fly under the radar a bit. Once Mikhail and Sora Segelovic, now they'd become Michael and Sarah Siegel. They settled into Cleveland and had 6 children, the last to arrive being our figure of focus, Jerry Siegel. When Jerry had turned 14, he and his expansive family had decided to move into Glenville, a predominantly Jewish neighborhood, and he was, of course, enrolled in the nearby high school. He was a quiet and shy lad, but made fast friends with an equally quiet and shy lad named Joe Shuster. If one had an idea, the other knew how to execute it, and it was all born from a shared love of science fiction, adventure stories, and movies. Around the time Jerry reached 16, he'd begun to write for the school's newspaper, the Glenville Torch, also adding his own little creation to the comics section, making a parody of Tarzan called Goober the Mighty. Enjoying what he was doing with the newspaper, Siegel also started writing his own fan magazine with Shuster, dubbed Science Fiction, the Advance Guard of Future Civilization. It was during this period, though, that the Siegel household was hit with its biggest tragedy. Jerry's father, Michael, was a tailor, owning his own clothing store, and one day in June of 1932, he attempted to stop a shoplifter. As a result of the physical confrontation, Michael Siegel suffered a heart attack and passed away. The Siegel family was left with some difficulty, and Jerry couldn't afford to put himself through college as he'd previously intended to do. Instead, he and Joe began to consider a proper career in science fiction and comics. It was during this period that they first thought up the idea of Superman, and actually went so far as to publish him in that fan magazine I mentioned, though granted their first draft was far from the Superman we eventually got 5 years later. This Superman was a villain, a psychic, and a megalomaniac. The word Superman was meant to be more intimidating than inspiring. So we move ahead to early 1935. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster are still working away at their ideas, doing some writing, but not really experiencing any kind of satisfaction. But Jerry was still a big fan of the things I'd mentioned previous, so when he stepped by a newsstand that had New Fun number 1, he paid the dime and took a look through its pages. Of course, it was a pretty standard sort of thing for Jerry, definitely more for his own enjoyment than anything, but his interest was piqued with the ad listed on the final page. Sadly, we don't have that ad anymore, a micro piece of lost media, but it was an invitation to submit your own stories for future issues of the comic. Well, Siegel put a bunch of his own together, slapped a stamp on them, and into the mail they went. It actually worked, too. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were hired by National Allied Publications and got to work, starting with their first story about a ghost-busting detective named Dr. Occult. At this stage, the duo basically had their idea for Superman ironed out. They'd pitched it to countless publishers before without success, but figured that National Allied might be the right guys to go with. Then, why didn't we get the Blue Boy Scout in 1935? Well, the main reason was that they felt that Superman wouldn't really gain any traction in a purely black and white magazine. He needed color. He needed to pop. So when Jack Liebowitz was working on Action Comics, a series that was guaranteed to be full color, opportunity finally came knocking. The snag, though, was with the rights to the characters. Harry Donenfeld and Jack Liebowitz knew what they were looking at when Superman was put on their desks, and they also knew how to get their money's worth from the hero. The conversation was simple, ultimately. It basically came down to this. NAP would pay the two of them a seemingly reasonable one-time paycheck, then the company would retain all rights to the character in perpetuity. Siegel and Shuster agreed, signed on the dotted line, and completely missed the line about never getting royalties while they pocketed a neat $130, which is only equal to about $2,800 in now times money. They got scammed, to put it in layman's terms, and they kind of figured that out after Superman sold about a bajillion copies and they had spent their $130 pretty much within the month. That being said, they were still allowed creative control over Superman as long as they kept working for the company and continued to get paid about on par with any other employee who hadn't just sold the coolest idea in the world for the same amount of money that it costs to get a new washer and dryer. Anywho, Jerry finds love, marries a woman named Bella Lifshitz in June of 1939, and the two have a son named Michael, after his late father. 2 years later, Siegel's mother passes away, another heart attack, and a further 2 years later, he's conscripted into the U.S. Army. Jerry didn't see any action, as far as we can determine. He started out as an airplane engine mechanic and quickly found himself as a military reporter, juggling a bunch of media positions at the same time, all while stationed in Honolulu. He even found the time to keep up to date on Superman in the comics during the time he was posted, which caused a bit of a stir after finding that the company decided to pull another fast one on him. Before he took his leave from the company, Siegel had pitched the idea of a Superman spin-off featuring a younger version of the hero during his growing phase. A Superboy, if you will. Nothing came of it, at least not right away, but Jerry, looking through another paperback issue of a character he made and wasn't seeing a penny from, noticed that Superboy was for sure being used in stories now. Jerry Siegel felt cheated. He got in contact with Joe Shuster, who also felt equally miffed, and they decided the best option would be to sue the pants off of the company for everything they could. Not getting too into the weeds about it, the duo left the courthouse with around $94,000 each, or around $1.45 million in today dollars. Obviously, DC didn't exactly want them back in the office after that point, so Jerry moved to New York in 1947 and got divorced about a year later. Also, I think it's important to say that thanks to the divorce paperwork, we have some insight into Siegel's actual takeaway from the lawsuit. After all the legal fees were paid, every T crossed and I dotted, Siegel only got around $29,000, which kinda sucks. I mean, that's equal to $447,000 now, but it's less than half of the actual settlement. So, divorced, Jerry pretty immediately remarried, this time to Joanne Carter, the woman who, up to that point, had modeled as Lois Lane for Joe Shuster to base his drawings on. March 1951, the two have a daughter named Laura, and 8 years later, Joanne convinces Jerry to give DC another chance. They give him a seat, but make it crystal clear that he's there just like everyone else. No special treatment, no exceptions, no rule bending. It goes smoothly enough, but by 1966, Siegel feels like winding up for another lawsuit, this time around hoping to get the full rights back for the Man of Steel from DC. They fire him in advance of the suit, he takes them to court, and comes out the other side with nothing to show for it. Obviously, no longer welcome back at DC Comics, he and the family move to California, and he works for a few other publishers here and there. Flash forward to 1975, and Jerry hears word that there's going to be a full theatrical Superman film. Seemingly having pockets filled with nothing but lint and a dead moth, he starts making a commotion about how financially destitute he is, and DC starts hucking $30,000 at him a year to shush. And he did shush. He went into retirement and basically only had one more difficulty: heart disease. It was something he struggled with for years, even getting a bypass surgery, but he still passed away from a heart attack at age 81. Now, Jerry Siegel was only one half of the Superman puzzle, so let's talk about the other one, Joe Shuster. Ida Katharsk was born in Kiev, and Julius Schusterowicz was born in Rotterdam. They, at some point, met and married, and immigrated to Canada. Again, common practice, they changed their surname to Shuster to fit in, and in 1914, Joe Shuster was born, amongst his brother Frank and sister Jean. Interestingly, like Jerry Siegel, Joe Shuster's father also owned a tailor shop. Around the age of 8 or so, Joe became a newspaper boy for the Toronto Daily Star and became an avid artist. His family was admittedly very poor and couldn't afford even the most simple of non-necessity items, so Joe would often travel from business to business, gathering any unused scrap paper he could to use for sketches and drawings, since they couldn't even afford their own sheets. Once he was 9 or 10 years old, his family packed up and made the move south to Cleveland, the city where he would come to meet his lifelong friend and business partner, Jerry Siegel. When the time came that Jerry discovered the ad placed in the back page of New Fun number 1, part of their submission was Joe's art. Again, the Shuster family wasn't doing particularly well financially, so those drawings were done on packing paper, of all things. But regardless of however that may have looked on the receiving end, National Allied welcomed the two aboard. Joe was happy to have the steady work, but most of his spare time was primarily spent still making tweaks to his and Jerry's Superman story. He decided on 3 big facets. Superman's alter ego would be Clark Kent, after actors Clark Gable and Kent Taylor. He'd work for a newspaper company called the Daily Star, named after Shuster's first employers, the Toronto Daily Star, and the city of Metropolis would be based on the very city he grew up in, Toronto, Ontario. And while Joe Shuster's art is honestly pretty recognizable, most of the characters were based and modeled on celebrities. For example, Superman himself resembled Douglas Fairbanks Sr. He also hired a model to base Lois Lane's design on, which just so happened to be Joanne Carter, the woman who would later go on to be Jerry Siegel's second wife. But despite everything that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster did to tweak and edit and improve their comic, it was still a difficult thing to sell to, well, anyone, really. In fact, after a particularly rough rejection, Shuster, in a depressed rage, threw their entire pitch comic into a fire. After a few moments of watching his sketches burn, Joe snatched what he could from the flames, allegedly rescuing only the cover. We've already hit on the major points while chatting about Jerry Siegel, so you know how things went once Superman finally started seeing the light of day. After the lawsuit in 1946, Joe Shuster suddenly had a notoriously difficult time finding reliable work as an artist. He took a step into drawing erotic comics for underground companies, being very careful to avoid getting himself identified. Being the 40s, that sort of art was just straight up illegal. Nudging the timeline forward, Joe's become dirt poor, living with his mother to watch over her in her advanced age, and trying absolutely everything he can to avoid just becoming altogether homeless. Pop art, comic strips, one-man shows, whatever can pay the bills. But it still goes further downhill from there for Shuster. By his mid-70s, he had to give up art entirely due to his radically failing eyesight. So, with no other option, he became a delivery man. Embarrassment hit him, and it got worse still when he made a delivery one day, only to discover that it was at the new offices of DC Comics. After being recognized, the CEO met with him, gave him $100, and pitifully told him to just find another job. But he didn't, in fact, find one. Instead, Joe moved into a nursing home, having become almost entirely blind. After the fiasco with Jerry Siegel in 1975, Shuster was offered the same deal of $30,000 per year to avoid bad-mouthing the company. He agreed, and managed to collect that money for 17 years before passing away from heart failure, still over $20,000 in debt. As a show of good faith, DC offered to pay the remaining debt to his estate, under the agreement that his heirs didn't attempt any further suits over the rights of the Man of Tomorrow. I don't even know how to conclude a story like this. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were two kids from Ohio who wanted to make something special, and really managed to do just that. Their creation has touched the hearts and minds of millions, if not billions, over the course of nearly a century. But when it came to what happened to them, after what Donenfeld and Liebowitz convinced them into, it was dark and sad, and it seemed like every day must have been built upon a needless struggle. Comics are a treat and can do so much good, but it can also be a front for backhanded business that genuinely leaves people out in the cold. But that's why we have to shine a light on the creators, the people behind the paper, because they deserve their time of recognition, of appreciation. So, thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Joe. That's right, fellas, our favorite neckbiters have entered the fray of the DC universe. So, we don't know where vampires really got their start in Earth 2, or really until Prime Earth, so we'll touch on that in a second. But what we do know is that they started cropping up here and there starting in the early 1700s, and in the DC Comics publication order, the first vampire appeared as an enemy to Dr. Occult, and we'll get to that confrontation right after we wrap up our intro to vampires. To briefly address the matter, since it's come up in so many forms of media over the years, Vlad Tepes, also known as Bad Vlad the Impaler, was not actually a vampire in DC Comics. Instead, he was an immortal Neanderthal named Vandal Savage who, well, we'll get to him sometime soon, I promise. Anywho, vampires, or going by their traditional name, vampires, are pretty freaking close to the cut and dry versions you'd find in other stories. So real quick, I'll hit on their abilities and whatnot, most of which I'd expect you're probably pretty familiar with. Enhanced senses. If you're trying to hide, they can probably still hear, smell, and probably even see you. Immortality. As long as the bloodsuckers are sucking blood, they'll stay pristine and youthful and oh so pretty. Any scrapes and bruises they get are usually patched up once they've found a new human juice box. They've also got superhuman speed, stamina, and reflexes. Your average vamp probably won't be dodging bullets, but they can sure dodge a blade if they see it coming. Most of them have some level of psychic ability too. Telepathy, hypnosis, it depends on who they are, and of course, who the writer is behind the page. Some of the older Night Stalkers can transform as well, at times into other animals like wolves and bats, or modifying their own humanoid visage to gain claws or wings as required by the situation. On the other side of the coin, though, are the classic weaknesses: light, garlic, stakes, starvation, and any kind of religious symbol, provided the one holding the item has faith and isn't just hurling a Star of David hoping they scare the thing off. Interestingly, once we get into Earth 1, Dracula does exist, though again it isn't Vlad the Impaler. Instead, his real name is Count Romanoff. He continues on in New Earth as well, though he gets dusted after trying to chomp down on Superman, who, if you didn't know, is solar powered. Oops. So I mentioned it up top, but we got an origin story for vampires in Prime Earth. Back when the world was young and Kane had slain Abel, he was banished from the lands upon which he was raised. Also, as an aside, a bunch of mythologies and religions are real in DC, so don't get too twisted up if you aren't on board with the Judeo-Christian history moment. Anyhow, Kane wandered the earth for some time, eventually becoming stranded in a desert. Finding a woman and straddling the brink of death, he took a bite out of her. The woman in question was Lilith, mother of monsters. She survived the encounter, and the two became immortal creatures who would occasionally find new people to feed upon, and on rare instances turn into creatures similar to themselves. Yikes. The date is December 31st, 1899. An unknown location in an unknown city. A cult has kidnapped 2 babies. We know not from where. One of the infants is a boy, the other a girl. The cult, you see, was undergoing a dark ritual to summon Satan himself, or more specifically, Neron, perhaps. Instead, they summoned a less powerful demon named Koth. All the same, Koth was not pleased by the mistake, and effortlessly consumed the souls of the cultists. A mystic named Zator arrived, too late to stop the summoning, but not too late to save the kidnapped children. Koth escaped, and Zator brought the 2 infants to his masters, a mysterious order known only as the Seven. They named the children Dr. Occult and Rose Psychic. Yes, his first name is Doctor. Doc and Rose are trained by the Seven at their secret citadel in India and taught the ways of magic. We never come to learn much about the organization itself. The 7 members of the Seven do change, though it's left unclear if they're replacements to the roster or if the existing mystics simply changed their appearances. In either case, The two become adept at sorcery, but Doc is seen by the group as the more capable of the two, and they succinctly reward him with an item we only ever come to know as the mystic symbol of the Seven. This little stone is quite a handy tool though. Over the years it's been shown capable of exorcising demons, deflecting magic, clairvoyance, and gifting its wielder with telepathy. By the 1920s, their training has concluded, and Rose and he have been instructed to seek out mystic threats and do away with them, but to also keep a watchful eye out for Koth. They arrive in New York City. Doc adopts the normal name of Richard, goes to college, and becomes a doctor of modern science, earning the title the regular way. After that, he becomes a psychic investigator, with Rose as his assistant and secretary. It was the 1930s, so I'll just brush by that little injustice. By 1935, the two are pretty slim on business, since most would probably prefer to hire someone saying they're an investigator rather than a psychic investigator. But things pick up following a string of murders. The police are stumped and, frankly, a little scared by the reports. Occult takes one look at the case, determines it to be a vampire, and takes that sucker out post-haste. This blood-siphoning deviant is the first vampire to debut in DC. The people are stunned, at least those who can believe in such things, and Dr. Occult is finally in business. A year later, and the Seven are under attack. It's Koth. Finally, Dr. Occult gets his 3-decade-long vengeance. After that, Dr. Occult went quiet, at least in Earth 2. But when the world was reborn as New Earth, the ghost detective got to see a little more daylight. World War II is underway, and Dr. Occult does his part in it, mostly by being a player among the All-Star Squadron, a gigantic team of Golden Age heroes facing the Nazi threat head-on. He also plays in the sandbox with the Justice Society a little bit too. Around the 1940s, the Seven also receive an interesting vision of the future. Out in space, like a flame in the dark, an alien vessel carries a child, the last vestige of a dying world. They don't know who he is, but they promise to become something great. Roll the clock forward and it's the 90s. Dr. Occult is semi-retired and is teaching some magic ropes to a promising young boy named Tim Hunter. It's here that we find something curious has happened during the Doctor's wilderness years. At some point, at some time, Dr. Occult and Rose Psychic were facing a powerful threat. The specifics of the incident change depending on who's telling the story, so it's a little fuzzy on details. But regardless, one of the two of them had suffered a fatal blow and was being cradled by the other as they die. The uninjured member of the pair, in an effort to save their oldest friend, cast a spell that would combine their souls into a singular force. They became bonded, and now Dr. Occult and Rose Psychic may shift forms at will, man or woman, occult, or psychic. They continue to pop up occasionally, doing the classic hero stuff and saving the world from impossible threats on cosmic scales. Once we get to Prime Earth, the good doctor is usually in their female form more than their male. They've become ageless, stopping somewhere in their late 30s or early 40s, and still watching over Tim Hunter, hoping for the best from the young man. So, 2 parts make up the Ghost Detective as they exist today. Now we move on to Rose. A lot of Rose's background is part and parcel with Dr. Occult. Demonic sacrifice, raised by the Seven, leaving for New York, etc. Most of the things unique to Rose, or at least what I'd like to draw more attention to, comes from the Prime Earth continuity. So, biggest of all, let's talk about the body switching. Personally, I feel like Rose/Doc's interchanging appearance can be pretty effectively compared to gender fluidity. Stick with me on this. They're most often Rose, but sometimes they're Doc. It's the same soul, the same person now, same heart, memories, the whole kit and caboodle. But sometimes they wake up and just feel more like a Doc than they do a Rose, so they're Dr. Occult that day, or maybe not even for the whole day. It might not be intentional, heck, I might be off the mark here, but I thought it was an analogy worth drawing. But back to their story, Rose, sometime fairly recent to the modern day, decides to move homes to London. Again, they're in semi-retirement, so it's not like they're leaving anything on the table in New York. Once in London, Rose joins The Other Side, an esoteric investigative organization. Think of it like this. If Dr. Occult was a magic private investigator, then The Other Side is a magic police department. Their goal is to investigate and deal with supernatural matters as they appear. From there, Rose has also taken up a full-time mentorship role over Tim Hunter, guiding the boy as best they can into becoming a future force for good in the realms of mysticism. Best of luck to them both. Jacob Lupu Blummer was the first of 5 children in a Jewish Romanian family plunked down in Hartford, Connecticut. His father, Louis Blummer, was the breadwinner, having been both the founder and dean at the Blummer College of Naturopathy. It was a controversial school because, well, it was naturopathy. In 1923, the year after Jacob graduated high school, the college was raided following an investigation of fraud. After all was said and done, 25 quote-unquote doctors were found to be in possession of invalid diplomas, including Jacob's father. It was only a week later that the former Dr. Lewis was slapped with paperwork for a divorce from his soon-to-be former spouse, Regina. She fought for and won alimony, custody of all 5 children, and $40,000 worth of their property. For reference, that's equal to $703,000 today. Humiliated and probably wordlessly angry about the situation, Jacob Blummer left for New York. Still inundated with news about the court proceedings, since they'd made national headlines, Jacob changed his name to Jon L. Blummer, and if anyone asks, there's no relation. He put as much distance as he could from his parentage and set out on his own. Age 23, John marries his love, Dorothy Tong, a secretary, and they get an apartment in Queens. At age 26, he enrolls at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, leaving after 2 years to get a more immediate job thanks to a troublesome little thing called the Great Depression. Now, it's unclear when and how John developed his art skills, or honestly if he even liked doing it, but money was money, and pulp comics were strangely big money. He went freelance with anyone who would pay him, and having a son in 1938, he needed as much money as he could get. Ultimately, Jon L. Blummer never worked for National Allied Publications as anything more than a freelance artist, but he certainly left a big mark trying to get his pockets filled for a rough decade or so. With NAP alone, he drew over 120 comics, which, in such a short period as it was pretty darn impressive. I wish I could give a conclusion for Blummer, but he was a pretty private man, it seems. We honestly don't know anything about what he got up to after the Depression was over. I just hope he made his wife and son happy with the time they got with him, as he passed away at age 51. So, like when I talked about Robin Hood recently, I'm going to give a description for King Arthur as a general figure, and then chat about what makes him different in the DC universe in particular. Arthur Pendragon was born in the 6th century, the son of King Uther, secreted away by Merlin for training to be raised by Sir Ector. As a youth, he approached the Sword in the Stone, Excalibur, and pulled it free. A pretty questionable requirement to become the new monarch, if you ask me. He becomes a noble lord over Camelot, founds the Knights of the Round Table, weds Guinevere, and does battle with his half-sister, Morgan Le Fay. Also, gross, he's tricked into fathering her child, Mordred. Gross. The changes to the story? Well, first comes with the Round Table. A couple extra knights get sprinkled in, most notably being Sir Justin and Sir Kent, both of whom appear later in the comics, so they'll come up further on. King Arthur gets his usual adventures, and like Robin Hood, our royal homeboy gets a couple visits from time travelers, though thankfully only twice instead of like 20 times. Lastly, comes with the fall of Camelot. The specifics change between iterations, but one way or another, Morgan Le Fay gains the final upper hand in the story, finding a way to overtake the kingdom and reduce it to ashes, rendering all memory of the days of King Arthur into rumor and legend, coupled with the demise of the king himself at the hands of his illegitimate and inbred son, gross, and then Mordred runs off with Guinevere. Gross. Why is the legend like this? Merlinus Ambrosius of the real-world Arthurian legend is quite a different creature compared to their depiction in DC Comics. There are some similarities. The Merlin of legend was still a magical entity, possessing the powers of prophecy, shapeshifting, the ability to disguise others, and likely more. Merlin, as written by Geoffrey of Monmouth, was born from the union of a human woman and an incubus, and in some iterations he's tied to satanic rituals as a child, which explains some of his otherworldly abilities. But DC takes these aspects and really runs with them. Unlike his medieval counterpart, the days of Merlin extend far beyond and far before those of Camelot. The timeline is pretty consistent before Prime Earth, so we'll just kinda pack everything under the New Earth category here. Merlin is not his true name, nor is what you often see his true face. The being we call Merlin is in fact a half-demon offspring of Belial, also making him half-sibling to the demon Etrigan. Over innumerable lives, he has also been known as Marzin, Merzin Ambroise, Aurelius Ambrosius, Merlinus Caledonensis, Myrddin Emeris, Myrddin Wild, and Macophaly Cutekin. In any case, despite his seemingly powerful background, Merlin just couldn't change fate. He took risks to save Camelot, even binding the soul of his demonic half-brother to his own squire, Jason of Norwich, to defend the kingdom, but nothing could stop their historic downfall. Merlin entered a magical slumber and was eventually awoken by his former squire, now living in the modern age as a man named Jason Blood. Trickery was afoot, under the closed hand of Etrigan, and Merlin quickly found himself banished to hell. Through a series of events, Merlin was broken free from his underworldly bonds, returning to less singeing planes, having now learned that Etrigan has truly grown to despise him. In Prime Earth, we've come to know his true name, Myrddin Wild. We've also caught a glimpse of his family tree. Interestingly, Trigon, one of the most powerful of demons, is his grandfather, which also makes Raven of Teen Titans fame his aunt. Also important to note is that following the fall of Camelot, he began plans to form a team of superhumans to protect the world from threats similar to Morgan Le Fay, leading him to found the team that we know in the modern age as Stormwatch. Merlin, as I'll continue to call him, is also explained to be unknowably old, perhaps being one of the first things to resemble anything human. As time has progressed, as it often does, he's come to learn that he's aging in reverse, little by little. By his own estimation, there will come a day that he reverts to an embryo, finally dying, and that very day itself will be the last experienced by the universe. Well, at the moment, he just looks like a guy in his 50s you might want to get to know at the bar, so we probably still have a ways to go. This is Crieg Flessel. He was born in Long Island to his parents Frank and Ida. Frank was a blacksmith, and Ida was about to have her hands full pretty quickly as a housewife, since Crieg was the first of 5 kids. Unlike a lot of the creators we've covered in the past, Crieg's life doesn't seem to have been one mired by financial struggles and business place backstabbing. Instead, it was an endearing life journey with a few unique moments sprinkled in here and there. Straight out of high school, he followed his artistic inclinations to the Grand Central School of Art in Manhattan, filling his spare time with independent lessons from his instructors, the biggest of which being Harvey Dunn, who painted "The Prairie is My Garden," which, isn't it just beautiful? He was also classmates and casual buddies with a guy named Charles Addams, creator of the one and only Addams Family. They never collaborated, but I love that they rubbed elbows in their college days. Post-college, and Flessel is drawing for pulp comics, a decent source of income. His biggest contribution being to The Shadow, a pulp hero first devised for radio back in 1930. It was during this stint that he noticed an ad in the New York Times. It seems that Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson was looking for talent and found some in Crieg Flessel. So our friend responded and hopped aboard National Allied Publications as a freelance artist. Recalling his start, Crieg had said, quote, "I don't think they were looking for any pedigree or would you do this? More like, you're a live body, what do you want to do? Take this and do it then." I realized they were desperate, so I had to go out and buy a drawing table. They had just one table that they were doing all of the mechanical work on, so I got a table and managed to find a chair and sat down, and they said, "Here, do this." I think I did a couple of center spreads for more fun. I did Fishy Frolics, I did an Acorn and Andy double spread, little nonsense cartoons, end quote. Of course, it wasn't little nonsense cartoons forever. He eventually started doing some more regular work with them, even getting to draw up some of the covers for titles like Adventure Comics and Detective Comics. It wasn't the only thing he did either. Flessel also found some more standard work drawing advertisements for businesses and things like soda and cereal adverts. His art was generally restricted to what's known as house style, but you can still spot some unique aspects to his drawings. For example, a lot of his cover work has these sort of thick lines, and everything's made to exist in an uninterrupted space, and you can see the items that assemble the scene individually. So weirdly at a glance, you can put the whole thing together right away. Cut to November 1937, Crieg has found love in a woman named Mary G. Marino. They get married and have 2 children. It's from here that Flessel works even harder at his art, basically showing up at the NAP offices and churning out sketches until closing. As far as I can determine, he didn't even flinch when his initial cover for Action Comics got canned in favor of the one we recognize today from Joe Shuster. Later on, Vin Sullivan took his leave of the company, choosing to start his own publications. Not one to look away from opportunity, Flessel became his associate editor while still drawing for NAP. The guy was a machine. He kept at it for a long time too, only really slowing down in the 1970s. Even then, he was still doing freelance work, including some more racy stuff for a particular bunny magazine. Crieg finally retired in 2000, moving to Mill Valley, but even still didn't stop drawing as a hobby. He'd submit his art to local events, talent shows, or just send a gag panel to the local newspaper. Correct me if I'm wrong, but with that smile and at that age and still drawing, this is a man who adored what he did every day, even into his smiling twilight. Greek mythology is a very fluid thing. Like a lot of mythologies, it started off as an oral tradition, so some of the details shift and change. So what happened to the Pandora of Earth 2 might be a bit different to what you've heard before. She was the first mortal woman, gifted many facets of her personality by the gods of Olympus. Zeus chose to bestow upon her 2 gifts, the first being a heart full of curiosity, the second being an item we now call Pandora's box, which she was told to never open. I wish I could call him out on the decision, but Zeus has pulled way more heinous stuff both before and after. It's just kind of his deal, but still pretty rude. Now, even if you haven't heard the tale before, I'm sure you can piece things together. Unable to resist her curious inclinations, Pandora popped open that box and released all of the world's evil, but nestled at the bottom of the container was something worth letting loose: hope. And that's pretty much her story as it's told to us. Pandora becomes a pariah and a famous figure of myth. It's literally one page, like, here it is, and that's all there is to it. Until Prime Earth. Yeah, so we skip through a few iterations of the DC universe, and once we get there, plenty of her story has been rewritten to fit the new continuity. So instead of being the first human woman given gifts by the Greek gods, Pandora was instead a relatively normal person living in ancient Macedonia circa 8000 BCE, and her son has grown incredibly sick. Doting on him as the illness worsens, Pandora is instructed to fetch some myrtle berries to blend into medicine. Simply put, Pandora's eye catches a glimmer in the woods and she discovers the artifact which would be forever after known as Pandora's box. Though, it really feels like an inappropriate name here since it's, not exactly shaped like a box. She pries that thing open and unleashes the 7 deadly sins upon the earth. In a panic, she races back to the village, which isn't holding up well to the sudden appearance of one of the deadliest forces in the universe. Then, within the blink of an eye, she finds herself in judgment alongside 2 others before the Circle of Eternity, a team of powerful mystic entities led by Momarigan, also known as the Wizard Shazam. And, they kinda suck. No, they really suck. They blame her directly for the incident and curse her with immortality so she can bear witness to what she's unleashed upon the world firsthand. Also, DC Editorial wanted to give her a design that pops, so the Circle also gave her these sick facial scars that continually burn just to add injury to insult. They chuck her back to the village, which is now laid to waste, and she buries her child. So sometime between then and now, she decides that the best course of action would be to combat the 7 deadly sins directly, and therefore starts training in the ways of magic. It seems like a course of action that works out pretty well since she's ranked as one of the most powerful magic users in DC. As you might expect, she goes on some mystical adventures, saves the world, yada yada. Then, as a new threat makes itself known, she's unceremoniously slain. We now know it was Dr. Manhattan from Alan Moore's Watchmen who did the deed, trying to keep his tampering with reality hush-hush, but that story is a long way down the line, so don't hold your breath. But Pandora was high on his hit list because, through some magic shenaniganery, she's actually the one who managed to saddle the Vertigo, Wildstorm, and New Earth realities together when things got rebooted in Flashpoint. She did this specifically to give the Blue Man Group reject more trouble to deal with while he fiddled with reality. How does that cause an issue for him? I'd like to know, but I just don't. While Batman was the big hero of Detective Comics number 27, Slam Bradley was the one who filled that role from numbers 1 to 26, taking a back seat once the Caped Crusader leapt onto the page. The Earth 2 version of Bradley was a pretty cut-and-dry protagonist, as were most of the others surrounding him at the time. Being the early days of comic books, there was this weird mix of A, writers who weren't super experienced with the format, or sometimes honestly writing in general, and B, those same writers not wanting to overcomplicate things, so anyone could pick up a random paperback issue and not be at a total loss as to who the characters were, and potentially even relate to them as a self-insert of sorts. Slam Bradley was a Cleveland PI who earned his nickname by usually foregoing the clever or investigative areas of being a detective and instead throwing hands at the problem, which varied wildly from aliens to time travelers to minorities. Yikes. So quickly dropping that version, let's jump continuities and move on to New Earth. In New Earth, we got a Slam Bradley working at the Metropolis PD, but editorial wanted to bring back a more classic version of the character, minus the dicey xenophobia, so this guy was retconned to be Slam Bradley Jr. Slam Sr. was brought in, an older, grizzled detective operating in Gotham City, being a more than little worn down after his Golden Age sidekick, Shorty Morgan, got the axe at the hands of some low-level drug dealers. Slam was an honest cop with that sad moment in his history, and he only really cropped up a couple times before Prime Earth. The latest iteration of our fisticuffed friend still fills the role of older senior detective in the GCPD, looking like he should really be considering just outright retiring at this point. He's worn down, tired, and enjoys a stiff drink while thinking about the good old days. Meanwhile, his son got dropped during the switch to Prime Earth, replaced with a daughter named Sandra, who's carrying on the legacy begun by Slam, spending her days as a televised detective while busting a whole new era of criminal wrongdoings. Slam doesn't come up much these days for kind of obvious reasons, unless it's time to pay some tribute to the first detective of Detective Comics, which usually includes him bumping elbows with his usurper, Batman. Now, I said Slam Bradley was the first detective of Detective Comics, and while I stand by that statement, he wasn't actually the first to do detective work. Speed Saunders, ironically, beat him to the punch there. Cyril Speed Saunders was yet another action man akin to Barry O'Neill who, unlike Barry, was a federal agent, but oftentimes found himself kinda doing whatever the writers wanted to write about. Hop into New Earth, and Saunders gets a little rounding out, though frankly not much. It's here that he's rewritten as a lifelong friend to the original Sandman, Wesley Dodds, and as such has always been somewhat adjacent to whatever drama they've got going on. As the sands of time creep onward, Saunders is now an old man, but still plays informant to the latest iteration of the JSA, especially since his granddaughter, Kendra, has become the latest to take up the mantle of Hawkgirl. We haven't spotted Speed Saunders in Prime Earth yet, but I'm sure somebody will bring him back in some capacity. Will Eisner was the child of Samuel and Fanny, who met during a family gathering. I'll let the phrasing of that set in for a second. Like, they were distant relatives, but I'd say if you meet for the same family function, it isn't quite distant enough. Anyway, Will himself was born and raised in Brooklyn. Poor, as immigrant families sadly often were, things were tense for a number of reasons, and the number was a high one. Will was bullied by his anti-Semitic classmates for being Jewish, though he wasn't practicing. His parents often fought about anything that came to mind, usually instigated by Fanny. She was disappointed that Will carried his father's interest in art, angry that Samuel didn't have a bigger income, and then when the Depression struck, that spread to her berating Will, a literal child, for not adding to that income. Boils my blood a bit, that last one. But despite these adversities, Will carried on, becoming an art student and pulp magazine fan, eventually working his way into a gig as a cartoonist for the New York American, as well as a cover artist for a few pulps. Scoot up to 1936, and Will's friend, Bob Kane, suggests that he consider comic books, since it's a newly introduced medium that seems to be picking up some steam. Now, he didn't start working for DC until a bit further into his career, but he did draw for Fox Comics and Quality Comics, which, if you've been keeping tabs, got absorbed into the DC monolith sometime later. And Eisner actually played a significant role in that. See, in '39, he was told to craft a knockoff of Superman named Wonder Man. When the day came that National Ally Publications became suit-happy, Fox was put up on the chopping block. Eisner testified with little coercion that he was told explicitly to make a Superman derivative. With that, the axe swiftly fell. After his days with Fox, he created a third-party hero named the Spirit, one of the big three of major pulp comic heroes alongside the Shadow and the Phantom. I plan to talk about each of them as a separate exploration one day, so I won't dive into that just yet. Sometime in 1941 or 42, Will was conscripted into the military, serving his term, making educational comics for the GIs, and then eventually made his way home. From there, he carried on with The Spirit, having found pretty major financial success. Once publication ended in 1952, Eisner went into semi-retirement, seemingly not intending to get back into comics at all. Tragedy also hit Will Eisner during his wilderness years. In 1970, his daughter, Alice, passed away from leukemia. Since Eisner's personal life was kept so private, most didn't even know of the event until he wrote about it 31 years later. Then, in 1971, Eisner was a board chairman for the Croft Publishing Company when he was invited to the Comic Art Convention by Phil Seuling. Will was enamored with what comics had become as a culture, having been purposefully unaware during the time he left it behind, but now it was bright and beautiful and probably in many ways nostalgic. The man was back on his horse. He wrote and drew new stories, including some for DC, and was recognized with awards and honors galore. Into the 21st century, in the final years of his life, Will Eisner became a frequent lecturer at the School of Visual Arts in New York. After his passing, DC Comics held a memorial service in Manhattan's Lower East Side as their way to show respect to the fallen titan, celebrating the full life lived by one of the first major comic creators. Let's say hello to Brian O'Brien. You might have noticed that he's our first character to begin their life outside of Earth 2. O'Brien was a New York district attorney who inexplicably decided to turn to vigilante justice. Their goals, aspirations, and even origin are all left unclear. But one day, he decided he'd start wearing a mask, the first hero to do so, and started cracking the heads of the corrupt. Maybe he got fed up with the justice system, or some gangster got away. The Clock has 1,000,001 skills and gadgets. Over his 7-year career, he'd been shown to be an expert in aeronautics, boxing, chemistry, crime scene investigation, disguises, hypnotism, safe-cracking, ventriloquism, and voice mimicry. It seems if there was something to master, he did it with total ease. On the note of gadgets, he had a cane that could fire the handle like a projectile, tear gas, calling cards triggered to combust a few moments after someone picks them up, and, well, torture devices. So I might like to argue that the Clock is actually somewhat of an anti-hero. Looking through his appearances, he definitely isn't averse to what can translate as brutal violence, throwing people around after they've already been shot, or shoving bad guys into his Iron Maiden as an interrogation tactic. The dude's walking on the fence of Punisher territory. Interestingly, while the Clock's developmental history is a bit muddled, it seems that they've also fallen into the public domain, since he's popped up in a few comics from other companies like Dynamite and Malibu. I think that's also bolstered by the fact that the Clock hasn't been seen in the DC continuity in nearly 80 years. So, rest soundly, you freaky work of fiction. Bob Kane was born as Robert Kahn to Augusta and Herman, two Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants who started their new lives together in New York City. Robert made high school friends with Will Eisner, creator of The Spirit, and had his name legally changed after graduation. This may very well have been one of the last original ideas he had for the rest of his life. So Bob gets to work and joins Fleischer Animations as a trainee animator, and then gives comics a shot a couple years later, basically seeing dollar signs when he thought about the potential growth of the format. He works for the contract company Eisner and Iger, run by his buddy Will, and they do a decent chunk of drawing and writing for National Allied Publications, the company that we know now as DC Comics. But Bob, overcome by the sheer weight of having to actually work on more than one thing per week, finds an unfortunate soul named Bill Finger. He hires Bill to work on some of his assigned comic strips, Rusty and Clip Carson, but as a ghost author. For the uninitiated, it means that Bill does all the work, or close to it, and Bob Kane still gets to slap his name on it and say it's his precious baby. So, Superman happens. It's a big success. In fact, calling it that is a total understatement. But NAP being a business, they couldn't just have the one product. They needed more similar titles. So Bob Kane rolls into the office and says with pure, smug confidence that he'll have something in a couple business days. Kane has said he drew inspiration from plenty of sources, including Douglas Fairbanks' Zorro and Roland West's The Bat Whispers, which itself was based upon Mary Reinhardt's The Circular Staircase. All of this inspiration came together in one creativity-driven night in Bob Kane's apartment to create the Batman. And here it is in its original inception. Clearly it was, bad. Bob knew it too, so he called up Bill and had him visit to give it a once-over. Bill Finger gave it a glance, then a look, and finally a review. It was too close to Superman in design. I mean, aside from the wings and domino mask, it was basically a palette-swapped Man of Steel. Now, I won't touch on Bill Finger's history today, that'll come later, but Kane himself eventually admitted, long after Finger was dead, that Bill was behind about 75% of Batman's creation and the related characters, just to put what comes next into perspective. Days later, Bob Kane rolls back into the office and hands in the Batman, created by Bob Kane. Just Bob Kane. Nobody else. Bill who? That guy? No, if he says he did anything, he's just lying about it. Ignore him. No, let him keep working in the office. I'll keep an eye on him. Anyhow, Batman's a hit too, in case you weren't sure, and Bob Kane is suddenly tasked with spreading Batman as far and wide as he possibly can. So he goes on to hire a solid half-dozen new ghostwriters and artists, and the most work he seems to put in is signing his name. Okay, maybe I'm being a little harsh, but he didn't even do his own art in the office, always at home. And frankly, I'm a little suspicious of the guy, even more than I was with the literal mob associates we've talked about before. But he still manages to have a working relationship with Bill Finger, since Bill really just wants his creation to be a good one, and Bill continues writing the comic even if his name isn't on it. After a few issues get printed, Bill goes to Bob Kane and essentially says, "Hey, Batman is talking to himself constantly. It's weird. Can't we give him a buddy to speak to?" Bob loves the idea and thinks that the sidekick should be a kid, someone for younger readers to see themselves in. Kane sits down and considers who this sidekick should be. His name will be Mercury, and he'll have superpowers, opening the doors for wilder stories on bigger scales. Historic comic writer Jerry Robinson pops his head in and does a little course correction. The name is changed to Robin after Robin Hood, and he's stripped of his powers, since it wouldn't really mesh with Batman, a man who would immediately wind up lower on the totem pole. So now Robin joins the fight in Gotham, and as a domino effect, inspires hundreds of other sidekicks. The next big step in Kane's career comes with DC's rare and most underutilized character, the Joker. The origin is disputed, especially by Bob Kane, but here are the cliff notes. Jerry Robinson, riding high after that bit with Robin, visits Bob Kane and Bill Finger and presents to them a playing card. More specifically, a Joker. This is the same card that gets used in a lot of the characters' iconography. Jerry says he thinks it would be a good concept for the next Batman villain, and Bill gets a stroke of inspiration. He pulls out a photo he had in a reference book of Conrad Veidt in his role from The Man Who Laughs. This is the face of the Joker. Bill Finger would go on to argue that the order of events was actually the reverse, with him finding the picture of Veidt first, but I think it's a negligible difference in all honesty. Bob Kane, however, would dispute the whole encounter, saying he came up with the entire idea of the Joker solo, and that Bill and Jerry were just desperately pawing at some undeserved credit. This guy. I've been avoiding mature language with these videos, but just know that in my mind, I've got more than a few choice expletives for him. Outside of the office, Bob meets and marries a woman named Beverly Majeski, and they have a daughter named Deborah. Now, alright, let me give some credit. While a lot of things with Kane's name on them are disputable, if not outright BS, he's got a handful of characters that everybody agrees are fully his ideas. These include Two-Face, Catwoman, Scarecrow, and the original Clayface. But if you thought that Bob's shenanigans were over, you clearly haven't looked at the runtime left on this video. So he leaves the Batman title in 1943 to work on the spin-off newspaper strip, but keeps a few ghosts on staff so his name doesn't ever leave the byline. 3 years later, he comes back, but hires even more ghost authors, so spectral that even DC didn't know about them. At this point, let's be real, it'd be miraculous if the guy was even doing a tenth of his own work. He's practically got a baker's dozen of underpaid, uncredited workers who were all stuck with him until the late 60s. So, in 1957, he and Bev get divorced, and after Adam West brings Batman to the small screen, Kane bows out from the comic industry and instead tries to finagle his way into becoming a minor celebrity. After DC, his fine art pieces were his biggest claim to fame. Of course, they were mainly created by more ghost artists. He also created a few characters for 2 animated shows, Courageous Cat and Cool McCool. 1987, Bob remarried, this time to Elizabeth Saunders, and later got the joy of being a consultant for Tim Burton's Batman movie in '89. Now, reaching the final stages of Bob Kane's life story, I think the next few details we have to cover kind of play like a greatest hits album of his consistently terrible behavior. Almost to his last breath, Bob vehemently defended his reputation as the sole creator behind Batman and Robin. Not Bill Finger, not Jerry Robinson, just him, and him alone. If either of them said anything, Bob called them liars and shut them down. It wasn't until Kane's autobiography, after Finger had already passed, that he said he deserved more credit for his contribution to the character. But I don't know if that really counts as an apology, especially since the book was also written by a ghostwriter. The man loved to talk about himself, but couldn't even be bothered to write the book. Bob received a posthumous star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. At the time, most believed Bill Finger was buried in an unmarked potter's field. If you're interested, and I'm not sure why you would be, Bob Kane's art and other things labeled as Bob Kane's art are still housed in collections at New York City's Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and St. John's University. This is the legacy of a man who claimed to be Batman's creator, the man who climbed to the top of the heap and spent the preceding 50-odd years doing one thing: punching down. The one redeeming factor is that more and more people are coming to realize that he wasn't all that he made himself out to be.